everything about this bad situation that we are in. And then after God tells him what we're going to be studying tonight, don't you worry about that, I'm fixing to hop all over that. Well, then he becomes upset and wants to know, well, how in the world can you take an evil group of people like the Chaldeans and use them as a tool against us? So notice verse 5, behold ye among the heathen. I think some of the newer translations probably bring this out a little bit. The first word there is definitely behold, pay attention, look here. But the next word is what we're called. And what I mean by what we're called is the word goy. And goy is what a Hebrew would call you and me, unless some of you here are from Jewish descent. It just means the nations. It means somebody who is not a Hebrew. So the goy, behold among the nations. And so you can see here that the King James translates this, behold ye among the heathen, almost as if pointing this at the Jews who weren't what they were supposed to be. And it really is a matter of interpretation, because it very much could be God saying, write this, there's a warning. Look out among the nations of who I'm going to raise up, if you will. So it's interesting there. That's the only two words we have. Behold and the pagans, Gentiles, goys. So behold ye among the heathen and regard and wonder marvelously. That to wonder marvelously is interesting because in the Hebrew Bible it's the exact same words. The Hebrews don't emphasize their language like we do. Like we say, that's really going to be in trouble. They would just say something like trouble, trouble. Like if you remember when God's name is holy, 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 they use the same word for emphasis, and that's what you have here. So it's really, you could translate this wonder, wonder. Wonder, wonder. They're emphasizing this is something that's going to grab hold of your attention. It says, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you. Well, verse 6 says, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans. Now, right now, brethren, Habakkuk is kind of like the seventh in the line of prophets. He is contemporary with Nahum, and he's contemporary with Jeremiah, to give you an idea of what's going on. Chances are the northern kingdom's already been carried away into that now. We can't pinpoint the exact date. There's no historical markers in the book that would tell you, hey, this is talking about X year. We don't have that, but he's not writing during the time of King Josiah, because what's going on with King Josiah? All these reforms, everything's really good. Things are going great. But as soon as King Josiah is killed, the next king, Jehoiachin, it's not so great. He doesn't do a whole lot. And so most folks believe that this is when he's talking about. This is when he's prophesying, right after the death of Josiah, sometime in that time frame. And why I bring that up is the Chaldeans are really nobody. They're just a Semitic tribe that lives out toward Babylon. That's where they're from. They really haven't made a lot of noise, although they're starting to. They have a king named Nebuchadnezzar. He is Nebuchadnezzar's daddy, and he is going to be starting some real trouble out in that area. As a matter of fact, he's going to throw off the shackles of the Assyrians, who up to this point are the big kid on the block. And so this is interesting because, Habakkuk's aware of the Chaldeans. He knows there's this group of people out there, but it's the Assyrians who've been doing most of the damage and have already carried the northern tribes into captivity. But notice God says, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans. Now look what he says there. I'm not allowing the Chaldeans. I'm not, hinting that they would go do this, or, boy, wouldn't it be great if they would. He says, I raise up the Chaldeans. Do you remember what God would say about Pharaoh? That Pharaoh, God says to Pharaoh, I put you where you are so that I can show my great power. I'm basically going to walk through you because you're not going to submit to my will. I've raised you up to this great pinnacle where you're the number one kingdom in the world. You're the greatest army in the world. You're the greatest power in the world. And I am going to humble you. And as a matter of fact, he's going to kill Pharaoh and his son with, of course, the closing of the Red Sea and so forth. So this is interesting. I raise up the Chaldeans. They're not that big a deal right yet, but they're going to be. Notice some of the things he says about them. That bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. In other words, they're going to go in and they're just going to take, and they're going to take, and they're going to take, because that's what's in their nature. They are a warlike group. That's what they do, and they are just going to take things that are not theirs. That's why those woes that we're going to see in chapter 2 all pointed at the Chaldeans, but we ain't got that far yet. But notice the providence of God. First of all, God is always working, God is in control, and God is able to accomplish all things, and God is aware of all things. Let's notice, God's always working. The word work here is used to show that God is skillfully crafting something. The Chaldeans are not coming to power by themselves. If you think how that God raised up Pharaoh, there's this country down in Egypt, they have this big river that runs through there, and so it's along the banks of it, it's very profitable. You know, it's a good place to live. And so life is good there. And so God makes things great there. And He raises up this king who He is going to bring down. First of all, He needed a place to bring the children of Israel. He needed Canaan. Canaan's going to go through this big thing where they're not going to have any food. And so they're going to need to go somewhere. So they go to the land of Goshen in Egypt. And how does He do that? He does that through Joseph. I mean, the providence of God. This is something God does. God says in Daniel that I bring down kingdoms and I raise up nations. And sometimes, as Habakkuk is doing, Habakkuk's looking around Jerusalem. He's looking around God's people, and he says, you know, we're not what we ought to be. We've really changed. You know, used to, people loved God, and they would go to the temple, and they'd pray and worship, but now we have all these different temples, and there's all these other gods. And you know, it had to be really a letdown when you had King Josiah come through, and I mean, he changes everything. He cleans house in Jerusalem. He knocks down all the idols. He destroys all the groves. He even goes to where we talked about this morning, and to the Mount Ephraim, where, you know, Jeroboam raised that first golden calf, and what does he do? He burns men's bones on that altar just like God said He was going to, that false God's altar. So He really cleans house. He's a reformer. He's a restorer. He is going to bring Israel. He brought Judah back to promise, brought Yahwehism, or God, the love of God, back, and God's the only one we're going to serve. You know, you can make people do some things, but changing their heart sometimes is a hard thing. Immediately upon Josiah's death and this reign of his son Jehoiachin, it seems that everything that he did was wiped out. They went right back to doing all the bad things they are, and that's what Habakkuk's writing about. All this violence that is around me, people taking bribes, justice isn't being done. We're awful. You know, brethren, if we're not careful, a lot of times we can think, well, that's where we are. God's not listening to us. God's not paying attention. Don't you think that for a moment. God's always working. You know, I was driving this evening here, and I was thinking about the idea of God working. And you know, what does the Bible say in Hebrews chapter 1 about the Christ? Who by His word, He upholds all things by the word of His power. When you think about this earth spinning around as it is and orbiting around the sun and the moon going around the earth and all of that, the Bible describes that as something that God is making sure stays in place, upholds all things by the word of His power. When you think that Jesus Christ created all things by His word, you know, He was the one that was active in the creation, Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. You think about all that takes, and then you think about my life and your life and all the people that live on earth, and that God is actively involved in all of our lives. Absolutely amazing. The word work here is used to show that God is skillfully crafting something. He raises up nations. He brings nations down. You know, sometimes we really need to remember that. God never sleeps. He's never going to leave you. He's not going to forsake you. The all-seeing eye that was in one of our all-song books of all, you remember that? Even while Habakkuk is accusing God of not caring and doing nothing, God's busy. And God's telling him, hey, I'm going to do exactly as I've said. This was a well-understood principle in Israel. Remember in Jeremiah 21, King Zedekiah, he wants to talk to Jeremiah. He says he sends for him. And notice what he asks him to do. Inquire, this is a question, this is from the English Standard Version. Inquire of the Lord for us. For Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is making war against us. Perhaps the Lord will deal with us according to all His wonderful deeds and will make Him withdraw from us. What's He talking about? I guarantee you He's thinking about Hezekiah. Remember when Hezekiah and the Assyrians came down and they were fixing to destroy Jerusalem? They wanted to. And that one fella told Jerusalem that was sitting out on the wall, don't believe in that king. Don't think your God's going to deliver you. The gods of these other people didn't deliver them. Your God's no better than them. What'd God say? Not today, my friends. As a matter of fact, you're not going to shoot an arrow here. You're going to die, and 185,000 of his soldiers died. People understood the working of God. The Jews understood the working of God. Here, King Zedekiah remembers God's active. And he asked for Jeremiah to come in. Will you pray for us? Maybe God will make this Nebuchadnezzar withdraw from us. So it's well understood principle. And folks, sometimes we just need to remember that as Christians. We struggle with life's problems. Just remember, God doesn't sleep. He's on top of it. Not only is He always working, but He's in control. Notice He says, I raise up. God is control. When everything is out of control, remember there's still God and He's doing His thing. Habakkuk was concerned about that God was oblivious to Judah's sin, but no, he says, I'm going to raise up. And you know, it's God whom the devil has to get permission to act. Notice Job chapter 2 at verse 6 says, and the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is thine hand, but save his life. What is Job saying? What is God saying to the devil? The devil wanted to do something to Job, and God says, you can't hurt him. So He gave him permission, and of course the devil just wreaks havoc in Job's life, kills all of his kids, takes away all of his wealth, everything, and Job still is still faithful to God. And so the devil comes back again and tells God, skin for skin. A man will do anything to save his flesh. And God says, okay, behold, he is in thine hand, but you can't kill him. So He has the leash on Satan, if you will. Same thing in Luke 22. Remember, Jesus is talking to Simon or Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. Jesus says, but I prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. You see, the devil was wanting to just ruin Peter, destroy Peter, but God was holding him back. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. If you haven't committed this verse to memory, at least commit what's happening here to memory. And that is that God is not going to put anything on you that you can't handle. He's not going to put more on you. You can do it. And while sometimes it may be very hard to figure out that way of escape, as it says, you can do it. God says He won't do it, and our God does not lie. God's in control. Think of Joseph. Think of all things that hated. Think of all the things that happened to him. Hated by his brethren. It was out of his control that his daddy gave him the coat. It was out of his control that he was born to his daddy's favorite wife, which in of itself is a problem, right? Polygamy is not something that is any good, has ever been any good. Something, brethren, I saw an article. This was in real news, not, some a brotherhood publication or some religious journal. This was in a real newspaper talking about homosexual marriage, and they're neither for or against it, okay? The only thing they were saying is that the homosexuals told us if they were allowed to get married, then that would stop a lot of the promiscuity. In other words, well, if we just had our mate, like you heterosexuals have your mate, then we wouldn't be out here, spreading AIDS like we are and have all these multiple lovers and everything. And so, that was one of the arguments. You see what's happened? You've held us down, and so here we are. We're living these ungodly lives. Well, we're not. However they would say that. We have all these multiple lovers. If we just had be able to get married, we wouldn't do that. Not so. The numbers are in, and that has not happened. Since homosexual marriage has been legalized and homosexuals are getting married, it has not dropped the promiscuity among the homosexual community in any form. And the bottom line is, when you have a perversion, folks, it's there. And it's not going to be normal because God created a male and a female. So we shouldn't expect something abnormal or something that God hasn't created to behave normally. Notice he was hated by his brethren. He was cast into a pit in the desert, and that was when they were, because they didn't kill him. Sold as a slave. He was lied to or lied about by Potiphar's wife. who was wanting him, but Joseph wouldn't participate, cast into prison, forgotten by the butler. And notice that the sum of all that, when his brothers are standing before him, what does he say? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. God was working. God was in all of that, making sure that Joseph was where he needed to be and could do the things that God intended for Joseph to do, and that was to save his people. God is able to accomplish all things. God is able. The Chaldeans were not a world power yet, but they're fixing to be. In Isaiah 14, verse 24, so 25 is not going to be there. And I'm going to tell you something, brethren. You know, fella ought not try to change his sermon midstream. What they say about changing horses midstream? You're liable to split your pants, right? So you need to be careful when you're doing that. I had put verse 25 in here, so you know what? I'm not even going to read this. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 24 through 26. What God is talking about there is the Assyrians. And he is in the letter of Isaiah. Remember, you have the different nations that are addressed. And what he says is that I'm going to take care of the Assyrians. He does that in verse 25, which I stuck in my newly improved version, which is not here. But what he says is I'm going to take care of the Assyrians. I have sworn, he said, it shall come to pass. He says it's the Assyrians, I'm going to destroy them. In verse 26, he says, this is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? That's rhetorical. Nobody, once God sets something in motion, is going to be able to stop it. And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? The answer is nobody. Once God puts it in motion, it is going to take place. Romans 8:31 says, what shall we say to these things? If God be for us, what? Who can be against us? I tell you what, brethren, we sometimes are the weakest people that we can possibly be. When I think of this verse, I'll never be able to read it again without thinking this. In the Knoxville Police Department, they had a sign above the door where the cops go in to have their shift meetings, and they come out to go out there and get shot at and everything else that happens to law enforcement in our world today. And they had a sign above that said, what shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? And you know what? Somebody out in Wisconsin, as they like to do out there, that freedom from religion, whatever that junk is, said, that's too religious. You can't have that. And you know what the city of Knoxville did? They took it down. Brethren, I do not understand. Why do we have attorneys on retainer? Why do cities have attorneys and then don't use them? If I had been the Knoxville Police Department, I'd have said, here we are. Sue all you want to, because you know what? In order for them to sue, it's going to cost them money. And they ain't got no money. It's just a bunch of people, few people, very few people, that are raising all this with the threat of litigation. And what do we do when something is with the threat of litigation? We run in the other direction, because we all know attorneys are expensive. Nobody wants to get involved in that. I say it's high time we do get involved in that. And let's take this to litigation if you want to, because our Constitution and our laws support the freedom of religion, not the removal of religion. Same thing here in our county. I wish they'd sue us. I wish we'd have to go to court so that we can pray for our young men's health to the Lord of heaven through Jesus' name for their safety and the safety of the other team. Who would ever think that we'd live in a country that would now say we're not going to do that any longer and not even put up a fight? It's enough to make angels weep. Notice God is aware of all things too, because sentence is against, and brethren, we have to remember this. We look around us and we see things and a lot of it's our fault. You know, we elected the people who are going like, oh, well, you know, those criminals, they're really good people too. We need to be nice to them. And those chain gangs where people used to have to go and do hard labor, and we don't need that. Well, they need air conditioning and television and cable and free health care and everything else that you can think of so that they can do their debt to society in the absolute comfort. Folks, it's our fault. If prison was like it was 50 to 100 years ago, people wouldn't want to go. As a matter of fact, they'd be terrified to go, and they might do what was right instead of like, well, I'm running out of money and I need a place to stay, so I'll go, do something and I'll have a place to. It's amazing. And why is that? Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. I have a guy, I like to read some of his crime novels. He was doing a podcast about a murder that had taken place in California. And the young man who was charged with murder happened to know he was a law enforcement. He had gone on from being in a gang to going in the Air Force and becoming a law enforcement person in the Air Force. It's amazing. You got to wonder what kind of background checks they do. But anyway, for 30 years, he kept that case in the courts. For 25 years, he was a free man. It wasn't until 5 years ago that they finally put him in jail and wouldn't allow him to have his bond. What do you think would happen if a person was found guilty of murder and then they appealed it, which we're a nation of laws, and they appealed it, and 2 weeks later the appeal came back and said, no, you're denied, and they executed that person? Let me ask you something. Do you think that the crime rates, that murder rates in our country would go down? You know they would. You know they would. Go to Texas. Look at California's murder rate. Look at Texas's murder rate. A lot of the problems that we have in our society today is because we've grown weak. We've accepted weakness from our leaders. We've accepted weakness from our judiciary. And we no longer do the things that we ought to do. And God says, because sentence against an evil work isn't done quick. You know, men will do whatever they want to do. They don't feel as though there's any punishment. Guys, y'all know the deal, right? I was a little boy, and when my daddy, when he would say jump, I was usually about that high before I would ask him, Daddy, is this high enough? You know? But when I went to Granny's, I was a different person. You know why? Granny, she had a whole different set of rules than Daddy did. Man, I could do just about anything I wanted to. I'll never forget a very tragic night in my life. I was about 8 years old. I was out on the front of her house in Anderson Avenue in Chattanooga, Tennessee, downtown Highland Park, and she had me go get a switch. I had never experienced such things. I tell you what, I don't think I ever experienced it again. Once was enough. But my grandmother whipped me. And I'll never, that changed my life forever. I thought that, you know, she wouldn't do that. I knew my dad would, so I behaved differently. I behaved differently with my mother because I knew she'd tell my dad, man, does she have a memory? But at Granny's, I could get away with some stuff, you know? Well, I tell you what, that's a precedent right there. I understood that here a different standard is expected. And so that's the same. God tells us, you know, we need to have laws. They need to be enforced. You know, I mean, look at Romans chapter 13. Talks about government. And what does it say? The government there is to reward those that are doing good and to punish the evildoer. And when you have a government that is rewarding the evildoer and is punishing the good, you've got a government that's out of whack. And it would help us in our cause to try to alleviate some of it. So a lot of it we look at and we say, boy, it's God's fault. No, it ain't God's fault. God didn't tell us to start taking him out of school and teach everybody that you came from monkeys. And so therefore you ought to act like monkeys and animals. That wasn't God's doing. That was our doing. We have done that. We have allowed people to be, what's frustrating, we ain't allowed it, we voted them in. And they get there, and then they don't do the things that we want them to do. They change our curriculum. They tell us, no, we're not going to let creationism be taught in school. You're going to teach this evolutionary concept of which there is no proof. It cannot be proved. Have we litigated that? No, we've not. Oh, it's amazing. Well, I guess I better get off my soapbox and get back to Habakkuk, right? God was going to use the Chaldeans, but notice, he didn't condone their behavior. Oh, no. He says, I will raise up the Chaldeans. They're bitter and hasty, and they're going to march through, and they're going to take things that don't belong to them. The contemporary English version translates that they're fierce and they're cruel. They're fierce and they're cruel, but they're going to be an instrument of God's wrath. Babylon would stand before the bar of God. And Christians today, we become demoralized when we see evil triumph. But remember, we all will stand one day before the judgment bar of God, and that's forever. This right now is just a temporary thing that we're going through. Wickedness in high places, justice, perverted, violence in our cities. God is aware and he's in control, and folks will answer. Notice what he says. They are terrible, they're dreadful, their judgment, their dignity shall proceed themselves. Their horses are swift as leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen shall spread themselves. Their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteneth to eat. Verse 9, they shall come for all violence. Their faces shall sump up, or face towards is how we say that. That's one of those archaic expressions from the King James that I couldn't even find the definition for, but you'll notice most of your translators, the Hebrew word there has the idea of facing towards as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. In other words, just grabbing up people as they go. They shall scoff at kings, and princes shall be scorned by them. They shall deride every stronghold. They shall heap dust and take it. Then their mind will change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this power unto his God. In other words, he's going to think that it's because of the gods. Of course, the Chaldeans were very paganistic. Their gods did this. He says, verse 12, this is Habakkuk now, art thou not from everlasting? He says, you're going to use this bunch to do this? He says, look, you're God. O Lord, my God, mine Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and O mighty God, thou hast established them for correction. He says, thou art of purer eyes than behold evil, and cannot look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously? In other words, the Chaldeans. And holdest thy tongue when the wicked devour the man that is more righteous than he. Well, this is as far as we're going to get tonight in the verses, but God's got an answer for that, and that's going to be chapter 2, the end of this, and then chapter 2. What do we do when everything appears hopeless? Well, we don't drop back and punt. Bottom line is, God is eternal, he's self-existent, almighty, and holy, and the rock, and that's all in verse 12. He's going to use no less than 5 different descriptions of God. Notice he's everlasting, no beginning, no end. God says, I am. That's a hard thing. Brethren, I don't know about you, but when I think about that, I'm thinking that's a hard thing to describe. Everlasting. God has always been. He didn't have a beginning. He doesn't have an ending. Jesus the same, Spirit the same. That's what makes them deity. The other heavenly creatures, angels, so forth, created beings, but not God. God is everlasting, no beginning, no end. And so that is what is being said here. Exodus 3:14, remember God speaking to Moses says, I am that I am. God is self-existent. In other words, nobody made him. He doesn't owe his existence to someone else. Self-existent. So the idea in verse 12, thou art from everlasting. In other words, he's eternal and he is self-existent. Nobody made him. Then the next one, there's 4 titles of praise and honor used for God. The first one is, O Lord, my God. The word Lord there, notice in your King James that it's all caps. That is, when you see that like that, it's a big, big L, but you'll notice it's a small, capitalized, small O-R-D. When you see that, that is called the tetragrammaton. That's those 4 consonants in the Hebrew language that mean God's name. We don't know how it was pronounced, if it's Yahweh, 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 how it was said. The Hebrews didn't pronounce it. When they got to it, they would simply say Adonai. They would replace that word with the word Adonai because they said you don't say God's name. They reverenced it so much. So it's dropped out of our vernacular on how you would pronounce it. So the very first thing he is called, the covenant name of God, is Jehovah's, how we say that today. That is God's sacred title. That is his name for himself. God is independent. He's over all things. Nobody is above him. Notice next, he is almighty. It says, the Lord my God. The word almighty comes from the title Elohim. This is the very first word that we see for God in the Bible. Genesis 1:1, all of us could probably quote it. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The word God there is this word Elohim. It's not God's covenant name, Yahweh, or the tetragrammaton as we call it, but it is, and it simply means powerful ones. Elohim, plural ending, powerful ones. It's a kingly position, powerful ones. Sometimes the word Elohim, now hear me out on this, sometimes the word Elohim in the Old Testament is not talking about the God of heaven. It's talking about other things that are powerful, okay? Because El simply means powerful, okay, or God, depending on the context, the letter El. That's like Daniel. What are some other names, folks? Help me out. Israel, Bethel. When you see that El on it, that's talking about, that's God, okay? Bethel, house of God. Daniel, servant of God. Elijah, El, God is Jehovah. So when you see that, but in the word Im just means it's plural. So sometimes it's used just talking about powerful people and so forth. So, but here it's used talking about God. He is Elohim. He is the Holy One. The 4th title, holy. He does not abuse his great power or mercy. There's no injustice with God. And that's something that we have to remember. And as Christian apologists, and that's what we are, and you might say, what does that mean? Well, I'm a Christian, and I must give a defense for the things that I believe. So I'm an apologist. And one of the things that you'll run across is people talking about how God can't be all good, how God isn't a very nice guy because he smacked down all those people in the Old Testament. He was going to use these Chaldeans to come in and kill multiple thousands, millions of people. He used Israel to wipe out 7 tribes of Canaan. And, you know, over and over again. Look at all these injustices, these women with babies being destroyed, these babies being killed. How can the God of heaven? First of all, the God of heaven is above all light. But do you remember what God said to Abraham, that his people couldn't have the land right away? He was going to give them the land of the Amorites, but they couldn't have it right away. He was going to wait some 400 years. And you remember why he told Abraham he was doing that? Because the iniquity of the Ammonites is not yet full. What was he doing? He was allowing these Ammonites to run around, have all the relations and stuff they did. If you ever want to see how heathen these people were, simply read Leviticus 18. There was no such thing as sexual boundaries. Everything was go. They murdered, killed, maimed, pillaged, raped, plundered. And God says, it's not full yet. I'm going to give them opportunity. They've got time to repent. They didn't. And so what does he do? He takes a nation like Israel and eradicates that and removes it. So as Christian apologists, as apologists for God, we have to be ready to explain to people how that's the case. These folks deserved what was coming on them. And as far as the babies go, if you're a child and you're born in, let's say, let's just say modern day India, what do you think the chances of you becoming a Christian are? I'd say it's very, 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 very small. Because around you, what do you have? Pagan influences all around you. Everywhere you turn, there's an idol here, there's an idol there, there's all these monks and stuff running around. And so if you're a baby and you were to have been killed in one of those wars, what happened to that baby? Well, you know as well as I do, they're safe. They're safe. They never were lost. They're going to be safe. So some of the things that we can talk about when we talk about the justice of God, there's no injustice with God. And this one word is kind of interesting here. Notice, mine Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and Almighty God. That word literally means rock. God is my rock. How many times do you think of David talking about that? God is my rock. He's my refuge. He's my fortress. I'm going to trust in him. That's exactly what that word means. God is the rock. Absolute stability. This man built his house on the rock. God said he's a wise man, right? Man built his house on the sand. Had some problems, didn't he? Boy, I tell you what, speaking of which, I know it's a little bit off subject, but don't you wish they built more of our roads on rocks? I heard we're 111 washed out again up in Bledsoe, Sequatchie County. That's you want to build on a rock if at all possible, right? And then sometimes that's not too stable around here with all the rain sometimes, but the rock, the idea of a bedrock, not going anywhere, absolute stability. These titles help remind us the great attributes of God. He always has been. He's powerful, he's just, he's self-existent, he's the rock. And we have to remember that when we're going through bad times, that it's going to be okay. God's in charge, and no matter what happens to me in this life, I'm going to trust in God. And we're cheating a little bit, but if you have Habakkuk open there, look at what the most beautiful, chapter 3, last 2 verses. Actually, last 3 verses. Most of the time, a lot of people think, well, if God takes care of me, then I'm going to take care of him. You know what? I mean, as long as he takes care of me, I'm going to serve him. Look at how Habakkuk's going to finish this book out. He says, although the fig tree shall not blossom. The figs were important in that area, for food. Neither shall fruit be in the vines. The labor of the olive shall fail. The field shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. In other words, times are bad. We're in a big-time famine. It says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. In other words, if God doesn't take care of me, Habakkuk says, I'm going to put my faith in God. Remember what Job would say when his wife said, why don't you have some honor to yourself? Just curse God and die. What's he say? Should God bless and, give and not take? He says, yet I'll rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places. Habakkuk says, no matter what happens, we need to remember that God is in charge, and we're going to be just fine. When we're distressed, when we're oppressed, when things are not going our way, remember, God's eternal, always has been, always will be. And he says that if we'll do what we're supposed to, if we'll listen to him and be a child of his, we'll be there with him for the rest of eternity. That he's the Almighty. Nobody's going to pull the wool over God's eyes. He's holy. He's not going to do something wrong. He doesn't play games with us. He's not a mythical character like the Greek gods who just likes to play games with people. No, God is just, and he is our rock, and he's stable. If you're not a child of God tonight, let me encourage you. The Bible teaches that salvation is in the Christ, gives us the plan of salvation, and says that if we'll obey the gospel, the Lord will add us to the church. We'll be his, and we'll be safe as long as we continue to be faithful, Revelations 2:10. If we can help you at all, we encourage you to come as together we stand and sing.